Yesterday, I showed you how Venezuela's collapse was engineered by banks and sanctions. Today, I'm showing you who owns Venezuela now, and it's not Maduro. Russia and China have turned Venezuela a single soldier. They own the oil for the next 30 years. They control the infrastructure. They have veto power over Venezuela's economic decisions, and the United States let it happen on purpose. Why? Because they needed China's cooperation on bigger issues. Venezuela became a bargaining chip in a geopolitical game most people don't even know is being played. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how debt colonialism works in the 21st century. You'll see the specific contracts Russia and China signed with Venezuela, line by line. You'll know how much oil is flowing to Beijing every single day, who approved it, and why nobody stopped it. And you'll recognize why this matters for Taiwan, Ukraine, and the next global crisis. Because what happened in Venezuela is happening right now in Pakistan, Egypt, Sri Lanka, and a dozen other countries. I'm the quiet financial historian. Let's follow the money to Beijing and Moscow. When Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, he inherited an economy that was completely integrated into the American financial system. Venezuela sold 60% of its oil to the United States. Venezuelan elites kept their money in American banks. PDVSA, the state oil company, worked with ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips on joint ventures. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank had significant influence over Venezuelan economic policy through loan conditions. American credit rating agencies determined whether Venezuela could borrow money internationally. Chavez looked at this system and realized something crucial. As long as Venezuela depended on American markets and American financing, he would never be able to implement his political agenda without Washington's approval. So Chavez started looking for alternative partners. He needed countries that could provide loans without demanding free market reforms. He needed buyers for Venezuelan oil who wouldn't care about democracy or human rights. He needed military equipment suppliers who wouldn't cut him off if he nationalized foreign companies. Russia and China were perfect partners. They had cash, they needed resources, and they didn't lecture him about governance. The relationship started small with diplomatic visits and minor trade agreements. But by 2007, it evolved into something much bigger. In 2007, Chavez traveled to Beijing and signed the first major oil for loans agreement with the China Development Bank. The structure was simple on paper. China would loan Venezuela $4 billion. Venezuela would repay the loan by shipping oil directly to China at market prices. The loan had a 15-year term with interest rates around 6%. Chavez presented this as a brilliant move. Venezuela gets upfront cash to fund social programs. China gets a reliable oil supply, and American banks are cut out of the deal. Venezuelan state media celebrated it as economic independence. But the fine print told a different story. First, the interest rate of VED was significantly higher than what Venezuela would pay for commercial debt from international banks at that time. Venezuela's sovereign bonds were trading at yields around % in 2007, so China was charging a premium. Second, the oil shipments were denominated in US dollars, not bolivars. This meant that when the bolivar lost value, which it did catastrophically over the next decade, the real cost of the loan in local currency terms skyrocketed. Third, and most importantly, the contract included a clause that gave China first priority on Venezuelan oil exports, meaning if Venezuela ever had trouble meeting the shipping schedule, exports to other countries would be cut first. China's supply was guaranteed. Between 2007 and 2016, these oil for loans deals expanded massively. China loaned Venezuela a total of $62 billion through a series of agreements with the China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank. These aren't commercial banks. They're state-owned policy banks that operate under direct control of the Chinese Communist Party. Every loan required approval from the highest levels of the Chinese government. These were strategic decisions, not purely financial ones. China was buying access to oil reserves and geopolitical influence in Latin America. By 2013, Venezuela was shipping 640,000 barrels of oil per day to China. That represented roughly 20% of Venezuela's total production at the time. And here's where the math gets ugly for Venezuela. The oil was being valued at market prices for the purpose of calculating loan repayment. But Venezuela wasn't receiving market prices in cash. They were receiving loan principal reduction. Meanwhile, the loan interest kept accruing. So Venezuela was shipping massive amounts of oil, but still seeing their total debt to China grow because they couldn't keep up with interest payments while oil prices were falling. In 2014, oil prices crashed from $110 per barrel to $30 by early 2016. Venezuela's revenue collapsed, but the debt to China didn't shrink at the same rate because the repayment was based on volume of oil shipped, not the cash value of that oil. Venezuela was locked into shipping the same number of barrels regardless of price. When oil was expensive, this seemed manageable. When oil became cheap, it was devastating. Venezuela was shipping more and more oil to China just to keep up with interest, while having less revenue available for government spending, imports, or maintaining oil infrastructure. By 2016, the situation became unsustainable. Venezuela approached China to renegotiate the terms. China agreed, but the new terms were even worse for Venezuela. The repayment period was extended from 15 years to 30 years on some tranches of debt. The interest rates stayed the same, and China added new conditions. Any future oil development projects in Venezuela would require Chinese approval. Chinese companies would get first option to participate in new joint ventures, and China secured the right to audit PDVSA's finances to verify that oil shipments were being calculated correctly. Essentially, China gained oversight power over Venezuela's most important economic asset. Let me put the scale of this in perspective. As of 2024, Venezuela still owes China approximately $60 billion. Current oil production in Venezuela is around 800,000 barrels per day, a massive decline from the 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s. Of that 800,000 barrels, roughly 400,000 barrels per day go directly to China to service the debt. That's 50% of Venezuela's oil production. Half of everything Venezuela produces goes to China before the Venezuelan government sees a single dollar. The remaining 400,000 barrels have to cover government operations, domestic consumption, and any other exports. It's not enough. Now let's talk about what China is doing with Venezuelan oil once it arrives. China isn't just buying the oil for its own use. Chinese state-owned companies are refining Venezuelan heavy crude and then reselling it on international markets at a profit. Venezuela ships the crude to China at below market prices due to quality discounts and the debt structure. China refines it, which adds value, and then sells refined products to other Asian countries at market prices. China is making money on both ends. They're getting cheap crude from Venezuela, and they're selling expensive refined products to everyone else. Venezuela gets nothing from that secondary profit. And it gets worse. China has also taken equity stakes in Venezuelan oil infrastructure. In 2010, China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC, entered into a joint venture with PDVSA to develop the Junin 4 block in the Orinoco Belt. This is one of the largest heavy oil reserves in the world, with an estimated 40 billion barrels of recoverable oil. The joint venture was structured as 60% PDVSA, 40% CNPC, but operational control was given to CNPC. They run the extraction, the refining, and the export logistics. PDVSA is a passive minority partner in its own oil field. The terms of the joint venture stipulated that all oil extracted from Junin 4 would be exported to China. Venezuela's 60% share of the revenue would be paid in the form of debt reduction against the loans from China Development Bank. So Venezuela isn't actually receiving cash. They're receiving debt forgiveness, which doesn't help them buy food, medicine, or spare parts for other oil fields. Meanwhile, China's 40% share of the revenue goes directly to CNPC as profit. China is extracting oil from Venezuelan soil, paying Venezuela in IOUs, and keeping the cash for themselves. Now let's shift to Russia. Russia's involvement in Venezuela started later than China's, but became just as significant. In 2006, Vladimir Putin visited Caracas and signed a series of defense cooperation agreements with Chavez. Russia began selling military equipment to Venezuela, including Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets, Mi-35 attack helicopters, T-72 tanks, and Kalashnikov rifles. By 2013, Venezuela had purchased over $11 billion worth of Russian weapons. How did Venezuela pay for this? Oil and loans, and more oil to pay back the loans. The key player on the Russian side was Rosneft, the state-controlled oil giant. Rosneft is run by Igor Sechin, one of Putin's closest allies. Sechin is often called the second most powerful man in Russia. He personally negotiated the deals with Chavez and later with Maduro. Starting in 2010, Rosneft began loaning Venezuela billions of dollars in exchange for oil supply contracts and equity stakes in PDVSA projects. Between 2010 and 2016, Rosneft loaned Venezuela at least $66 billion. The loans were structured similarly to China's deals. Venezuela would repay with oil shipments, and Rosneft would have operational control over specific oil fields. In 2016, as Venezuela's economy was in freefall, Rosneft gave Venezuela a $1.5 billion emergency loan. The collateral for this loan was 49.9% of Citgo, PDVSA's wholly owned subsidiary in the United States. Citgo is a major oil refining and distribution company with 3 large refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and Illinois. It also owns a network of pipelines and 5,000 gas stations across the United States. Citgo's assets are worth somewhere between $8 billion and $10 billion. Venezuela pledged half of Citgo as collateral for a $1.5 billion loan. That's insane. But Venezuela was desperate. They needed cash immediately, or the government would collapse. When Venezuela inevitably defaulted on the Rosneft loan in 2017, Rosneft moved to seize Citgo. This created a massive geopolitical problem. The United States government did not want a Russian state-owned company controlling critical energy infrastructure on American soil. The Trump administration stepped in and blocked the seizure by imposing sanctions that prevented the transfer of Citgo shares to Rosneft. Rosneft was furious. They had a legal contract. Venezuela had defaulted, and Rosneft should have been able to claim the collateral. But the US government essentially said, no, you can't have it, and there was nothing Russia could do. So what did Rosneft do? They sold their claim on Citgo to a Russian oligarch named Mikhail Gutsariev. Technically, Gutsariev is an independent businessman. In practice, he's deeply connected to the Kremlin. This was a workaround. The US had blocked Rosneft from taking Citgo, but they couldn't block a private Russian citizen from holding a claim on it. As of today, Citgo's ownership is still tied up in legal battles. The Venezuelan opposition, which the US recognizes as the legitimate government, is trying to maintain control of Citgo, but Gutsariev and other creditors are in line to seize it if Venezuela is ever forced to liquidate assets. Beyond the Citgo disaster, Rosneft also took operational control of several oil fields inside Venezuela. In 2012, Rosneft bought out the Italian company Eni's stake in the Perla natural gas field. In 2016, Rosneft took a 40% stake in 5 PDVSA oil projects. What does operational control mean? It means Rosneft decides how much to produce, where to sell it, and how to allocate revenue. PDVSA is once again a minority partner in its own oil fields. And just like with China, the oil extracted by Rosneft doesn't stay in Venezuela. It's exported to Russia or sold on international markets, with the proceeds going to Rosneft's accounts. In 2019, when the United States imposed full sanctions on Venezuela and banned American companies from buying Venezuelan oil, Russia and China became the only major buyers. This gave them even more leverage. Venezuela couldn't sell to Europe, couldn't sell to the United States, and had limited options in Asia beyond China. Russia and China could name their price, and they did. By 2020, Venezuela was selling oil to Russia and China at discounts of 30% to 40% below global benchmark prices. Russia and China would take the oil, refine it, or re-export it and make massive profits. Venezuela got pennies on the dollar. Russia also sent military and intelligence support to Venezuela during this period. In 2019, Russia deployed 100 military personnel to Venezuela, officially as advisors. They brought S-300 air defense systems with them. The message was clear. If the United States or anyone else tried to intervene militarily in Venezuela, Russia would be there. This was a direct warning to Washington. Venezuela was now under Russian protection. Around the same time, Russian private military contractors from the Wagner Group were reportedly operating in Venezuela, providing security for gold mining operations in the southern part of the country. Which brings me to gold. Venezuela has significant gold reserves, both in the ground and in its central bank. In 2018, facing a cash crisis, Maduro started selling gold to raise hard currency. Who was buying? Russia and China, but not at market prices. Reports from defectors and investigative journalists revealed that Venezuela was selling gold to Russian and Chinese buyers at 20% to 30% below spot prices. Why would Venezuela accept such bad terms? Because they were desperate, and Russia and China were the only buyers willing to deal with a sanctioned country. The gold was flown out of Venezuela on Russian cargo planes. Some estimates suggest Venezuela sold over 1 billion worth of gold to Russia between 2018 and 2020. China is also deeply involved in Venezuelan gold mining. Chinese companies operate mines in the Arco Minero del Orinoco, a massive mining region in southern Venezuela. The area is rich in gold, diamonds, coltan, and other valuable minerals. The Venezuelan government gave Chinese firms mining concessions in exchange for loans and investment. But there's almost no transparency. Independent journalists who try to report on the mines are blocked by the military. Environmental groups say the mining is destroying vast areas of rainforest and contaminating rivers with mercury. And the revenue? It's unclear how much actually makes it back to the Venezuelan government. Much of the gold appears to be exported directly to China without ever being recorded in official statistics. So let's add it all up. China takes 400,000 barrels of oil per day. Russia takes another 100,000 barrels per day through Rosneft's contracts. China and Russia have equity stakes in Venezuela's most productive oil fields. They control operational decisions. They're extracting gold and other minerals. They've sold Venezuela over 11 billion in military equipment, which Venezuela is still paying off. And they have veto power over any new oil projects through the contracts they signed. Venezuela is a sovereign country in name only. In practice, Russia and China control Venezuela's economy. And here's the geopolitical dimension that most people miss. The United States knows all of this. The CIA has detailed intelligence on every contract, every shipment, every payment. The Treasury Department tracks Russian and Chinese transactions with Venezuela, and they've chosen to do almost nothing about it. Why? Because the United States has bigger priorities. In 2021, when Joe Biden became president, his administration needed China's cooperation on climate change negotiations, managing the COVID-19 pandemic response, and containing North Korea. Picking a fight with China over Venezuela would have derailed those efforts, so Venezuela was sacrificed. Similarly, before the war in Ukraine, the United States needed Russia's cooperation on the Iran nuclear deal and on Middle East security issues. Venezuela wasn't important enough to risk those relationships, so Russia got a free pass. Venezuela became a pawn in great power politics. Now, after the Ukraine war started in 2022, US-Russia relations are completely broken. But by then, Russia had already locked in their contracts and control over Venezuelan oil. It was too late to undo it. And here's the really disturbing part. The model that Russia and China perfected in Venezuela is now being exported globally. Look at what China is doing across Africa and Asia through the Belt and Road Initiative. They loan money to poor countries to build infrastructure. The projects are executed by Chinese companies using Chinese workers and Chinese materials. When the countries can't repay, China takes equity in the infrastructure or secures long-term resource extraction rights. It's the exact same playbook. Sri Lanka couldn't repay loans for the Hambantota port, so China took a 99-year lease. Kenya is struggling to repay loans for a railway, and now China has claims on the port of Mombasa. Pakistan owes China over 60 billion for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and Chinese companies are now getting mining rights to copper and gold deposits as partial repayment. Russia is doing a similar thing in former Soviet states. Belarus owes Russia billions and has essentially given up economic sovereignty. Russia controls Belarusian energy infrastructure and has military bases there. Armenia relied on Russian loans and now hosts Russian military bases. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are both heavily indebted to Russia and China, and both have seen Chinese and Russian companies take control of mines and energy projects. This is 21st century colonialism. No military invasions, no annexations, just debt, contracts, and quiet takeovers. And the contracts are designed to survive regime change. Even if Maduro is overthrown tomorrow and a pro-Western government takes power in Venezuela, they would still be bound by the contracts Chavez and Maduro signed. The debt is sovereign debt, meaning it's owed by the Venezuelan state, not by a specific government. A new administration would inherit 70 billion in debt to China and Russia, along with decades of locked-in oil shipments and joint venture agreements. They couldn't just tear up the contracts without facing international lawsuits and asset seizures. China and Russia would sue in international arbitration courts and win. They'd seize Venezuelan assets abroad, including any foreign bank accounts, embassies, and possibly even Citgo if they could get past US sanctions. This is why China and Russia aren't actually that worried about whether Maduro stays in power. They've already won. The contracts are locked in for decades. Whoever governs Venezuela is trapped. If they try to renegotiate, China and Russia will just offer new loans with even worse terms. If they refuse to honor the contracts, they'll be cut off from international markets entirely. There's no escape. Let me give you a concrete example of what Venezuela's future looks like. Let's say a new government takes over in 2026. They inherit the current debt and contracts. Oil production is around 800,000 barrels per day. 400,000 barrels go to China, 100,000 barrels go to Russia. That leaves 300,000 barrels per day for everything else. Venezuela's domestic consumption is around 200,000 barrels per day. That leaves only 100,000 barrels per day that the government can actually sell for cash to buy food, medicine, and spare parts. At 70 per barrel, that's $7 million per day or $2.5 billion per year. That's not enough to run a country of 28 million people. It's not enough to rebuild infrastructure. It's not even enough to properly maintain the oil fields they still control. Venezuela would be locked in poverty for a generation. And the worst part, this outcome was predictable. When Chavez started signing these deals in 2007, economists warned that the terms were bad. Opposition politicians in Venezuela warned that the country was trading long-term sovereignty for short-term cash. International analysts said China and Russia were setting a debt trap. But Chavez didn't care. He needed money to fund his social programs and maintain political support. And Maduro inherited the consequences. Now millions of Venezuelans are paying the price. 7 million have fled the country. Those who remain face shortages, hyperinflation, collapsing infrastructure, and a government that has no money because it's all going to Beijing and Moscow. So here's my final question for you. If Russia and China own Venezuela, and they're using the same playbook in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and a dozen other countries, how many countries will they own in 20 years? What happens when half of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are economically controlled by Beijing? What happens when China has veto power over global commodity supplies? What happens when the United States wakes up and realizes they've lost entire continents without firing a single shot? That's the world we're heading into, and most people have no idea it's happening. Tomorrow, I'm releasing part 3 of this series. I'm going to show you the exact warning signs of a debt trap and which countries are next. Because if you can see the pattern, you can see the collapse coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which country do you think China or Russia will take over next? I'll respond to every one. I'm the quiet financial historian. Stay vigilant.